we'll go ahead and get started. I think a few more people will be trickling in, but in the interest of time, I think let's just jump right in. So during the presentation portion, I'm going to ask for participants to stay muted. There will be plenty of time to ask questions and get answers. Thank you all for joining us today to talk about intergenerational communications. We've all spent our careers learning how to talk with diverse audiences, but how often do we really think about the role generations play and how those messages are received? This morning, we'll be delving into that topic with our featured speaker, Rabbi Chaim Herring, and with our intergenerational panel. For those of you who don't know me, I am Cassie Roman, and I'm a senior account executive at Pineapple RM and a long-term Minnesota PRSA member. I will be your moderator this morning and will also be sharing some of my personal insights as a millennial, which means, yes, I did have a MySpace and go through that awkward emo phase. For today's event, we'll start by hearing from Rabbi Herring, as he shares some insights he's gleaned from his research on generations. Following his presentation, there will be brief opportunities to ask him questions before we move into our panel discussion. You're encouraged to engage with the panel and ask questions or leave comments in the chat. Before we begin, I'd also like to take a brief moment for a housekeeping item. This year's PRSA Midwest District Conference will be taking place here in the Twin Cities, September 18th through 20th. Registration is open now and early bird pricing is available through July 31st. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker for this morning. Rabbi Chaim Herring is an author, presenter, and nonprofit organization futurist specializing in faith-based communities. A former congregational rabbi and C-suite nonprofit executive, Chaim blends original research and real-world experience to inspire individuals and organizations to achieve their greatest impact. He has published over 60 scholarly and popular articles and studies about the intersection of technology, spirituality, and community. His recent books include Connecting Generations, Bridging the Boomer, Gen X, and Millennial Divide, and Leading Congregations and Nonprofit Organizations in a Connected World. Take it away, Chaim.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. And Cassie, thanks for the invite to be here. I really love the sort of description at the beginning of who I am, because Rose McKinney, my dear friend, helped with my branding statement many, many years ago. So it's nice to have her here and to acknowledge her many, many talents. And what is a rabbi doing talking about this topic? Well, first of all, I have a PhD in organization and management. And another fascination of mine is, how is it that people organize for purpose, right? I mean, organizations, companies are not just, I guess, entities, but they're like containers for meaning. And that's where the connection between my faith background and my business background come into play. Just a couple more minutes about why this topic is really so critical to me. I began in 1985 as a very young congregational rabbi, and no one had ever told me that in the morning I might be with preschool kids, mid-afternoon book review group for retirees, my dreaded bewitching hour at about 4 p.m. with teens, whom I actually came to love working with, and in the evening, a study group. Not once in my many years of training did someone tell me, it might be a good idea to have more than one communication style, because you'll be dealing with the gamut of people in your congregation. Fast forward to a couple years ago, when this topic again, because it's more than a couple years ago, I watched what was happening in our society, in companies, in communities. And I saw like this social isolation that people had been writing about and researching. But what really drove it home, this lack of generational connection, was I had about a month period when I had lunch with 3 people. The youngest was 75. The oldest at the time was about 95. And in different ways, although each of them had families who really cared for them, they said to me, I feel like young people are polite. They say hello, but I just don't have any way to connect to them. They don't seem to be interested in me. I don't want to lead anything anymore, but I love learning and being around young people. I've also been involved for decades in an organization called Search Institute, which really is phenomenal in trying to understand what developmental relationships mean for youth and teens. And again, same issue. Teens don't have adults in their lives. Parents aren't cool. Teachers are too busy with administration. Who do they have to talk to today? So at both ends of the spectrum and in the middle, we have people who are desirous of relationships, and we seem to have forgotten how to do that. So that's why this really matters to me so much, and I know it matters to you. Regardless of your setting, we all have a stake, I think, in addressing this issue. I'm working on a book called From Generation to Generation in a Digital Age. Recently surveyed over 650. This is for the Jewish community, but we have some specific issues. We're a microcosm of the broader community. I surveyed over 650 boomers, Gen Xers. We even got a good number of millennials as well. And this was before the pandemic had started. We designed the questionnaire, obviously redesigned it when the pandemic really, I think we began to understand what it meant. I'll be sharing some of that research, and I was reminded when I was speaking with Cassie earlier that working with Rose, I had done at the beginning of the pandemic around June 2020 or May 2020. It was before George Floyd was murdered, so I didn't have a chance to ask about some social protest issues. But I surveyed some Gen Zers primarily and some millennials on their thoughts about technology, relationships, online learning, and views about the future. So I have some really good data. I rely on what other people have written as well. And let's just go to it. So I had to put in a subtitle like "Ban Boomers from TikTok." And this is just not targeted at boomers. We each have our different generational communication styles. And this was just me poking a little bit of fun at myself. Here's a little bit more fun because I really believe that laughter and creativity go hand in hand. I also think it's good for the soul in this day and age. So if you want this t-shirt, I'm sure that you could find it online. For me, my wife tells me that, which one? Talk to you louder. The last one is one that she says that she needs to do with me all the time. So that's why that t-shirt resonates. You can purchase this book. I think the photo is very evocative of our situation today, right? Together, but very much alone. A couple of terms before we get into the intergenerational communications issue. I want to distinguish between multi-generational and intergenerational. Multi-generational is a number, right? It's an empirical fact. How many generations are alive at one time? We'll have to see what happens with the pandemic. There has been for the first time, pardon me, in the States for a while, a decrease in the number of years that people live. It's down a couple of years. I am hopeful that will, I believe it will recover. In fact, prior to the pandemic, the fastest growing segment, it was small, but fastest growing was people over 100. So we may be approaching that biblical age of 100. That means 7 generations alive at one time. It means 5 generations in the workplace. Intergenerational is a value, right? It's a mindset, it's a commitment, it's practices and resources dedicated to making sure that each generation feels like it has a stake in the other's success. It doesn't happen by accident. Proximity, right? Putting people of different generations together doesn't mean that suddenly you're intergenerational. In fact, if you don't think about how that happens, it can be rather disastrous, right? You need people who understand how to bring intergenerational teams together and really help foster that mindset by shared action that shows the value of each generation contributing insights, skills, perspectives into the workplace. I'm not going to go over the cohort years, but if you're wondering, you know, what these 7 generations are. So when I dedicated my book, my last book, I dedicated it to my 90, I think it was 92 or 93-year-old rabbi. By the way, I still speak with him every Friday. He just turned 98. And my first granddaughter had just, I think she was maybe a month old. It's almost 100 years between the two of them. Question: where's the playbook for 7 generations? You know, Dorothy Miller, a sociologist in 1981, could talk about the sandwich generation. An average sandwich squares, I think it's about 4 to 5 inches on each side, with, you know, sandwich, something in the middle, 2 slices of bread, digestible, right? Miller used that metaphor for primarily women who were raising children, trying to develop a career, and also taking care of elderly parents or in-laws. Fast forward 7 generations, to me, it's like, depending upon the region that you live, it's like a hoagie or a sub or a gyro, you know, and it takes a long time to digest. And in fact, we can often get indigestion, right? Because under the same roof, we may have a boomer who is still trying to look for work, and a millennial who's just going gangbusters with her career, right? The other thing about this hoagie metaphor is it means that anywhere along that point, that generational spectrum, each of us are vulnerable to sudden changes. We're all in the same boat in that way. All right, so we've got multi-generational, a number, intergenerational value, and we need new metaphors to help us capture this generational continuum. Now, God bless you. Now I'm going to throw a little bit of a curveball at Cassie, which she should be expecting by this point. You thought that you're going to hear a discussion about intergenerational communications, which you will. But to me, intergenerational communications, that's really like scratching the surface. It's very tempting to say, oh, let's just learn how different generations communicate and let's everybody be understanding. You really have to know generational theory, because generational theory helps us understand the culture of each generation. I'm not talking about the culture of the workplace, but each generation has its own culture. And if you're only going to deal at the very superficial level of communications, like what tools work best, well, you're really not going to know whether or not they work or whether or not they're alternative ones, unless you understand generational theory, which I will define in a moment. The other big wild card is both the current impact and the aftermath of COVID-19. If we thought that people were isolated before COVID, and they were. I mean, I think Ipsos did a big study back in about 2018 or 19 that most people that whom they surveyed didn't even have one individual whom they could call a close friend. So yeah, it was bad before, but you know, everybody's kind of lived on like Brady Bunch tiles or Hollywood Square, depending upon your generation. The workplace is in flux right now. People are very ambivalent or actually adamant that they don't want to go back to work. And it's really kind of tough. So we're going to move along. You go to Pew Research, look up generational theory. You'll understand these terms. And then we're going to just take 5 minutes, 10 minutes and go right to the discussion about what works best in terms of communications. There are three concepts. One is developmental stage effects. If you know psychology, or even if you don't, I think it's important to look up Erik Erikson. His stages of development have been modified rightfully. First of all, to include people who are living like well past 80. But human development is something that every person goes through. You know, these stages aren't linear. We may move back and forth, but our bodies, our minds, and our emotions change over time, and they affect our priorities. The next term is period effects. So a period effect means that several generations, at least two, may have experienced the same significant event, and that creates actually a shared kind of discussion. People from different generations or within different the same generation may interpret that event differently, but we all experience. And I listed a couple of examples right there. And these developmental stage effects are internal, the period effects are external, but they're significant enough where we all have that aha moment. I remember where I was when, you know, and people from different generations can say that. Cohort effects are different. Those are transformative effects that really shape our worldview. They tend to hit us at a critical developmental stage when we're forming our sort of outlook on life. And you might think of, you know, 9/11, you know, that was a period effect because a lot of generations felt it. Was the millennials who really, I would say, felt it the most. Great Depression, you know, all of these big events. All right, now we're going to take a detour and hopefully go into the matrix. Let me just bring this up, and we're going to share another document. And I do understand that I need to pick up the pace a little bit. Okay. I'm going to make this larger too. Okay, so I honestly only thought about a way to organize generational theory with intergenerational communications. And this is where culture and communications come into play. And by the way, to me, this matrix does two things. It gives me an understanding of shared points of interest and potential work. And it also brings into relief, right, just how different, how much discontinuity there has been across generations, which leads to this issue of why is it so hard to communicate today, right? It's not just the number of generations. It's not just preferences for different technologies. It's because we think and see the world so very differently. So if we take a look at Gen Z, and this came up in all of my research, by the way, you know this, very visual, They don't like text. I think the panelists were we were laughing yesterday, please, I'm not going to get a Snap account. And I certainly, TikTok scares me a little bit. But if you don't understand that the always on generation, right? They are post digital revolution. Cassie mentioned that she can remember a time when there was MySpace. But, Gen Zers can't even imagine what the world was like without being connected. So of course they're going to be more visual because that's really their medium. We don't know. We also know that, for example, and this shows up in the workplace, right? Gen Zers, a lot of anxiety and depression because their physical safety was often threatened growing up. First generation to grow up with, drills for school shootings. Millennials. Well, millennials. Well, you had kind of a good time for a while, but boy, did you get a raw deal when the market tanked and, we almost moved from a recession to a depression in 2007, 2008. So you do have memories of kind of a pre-digital time, but, not so many. Everybody uses Facebook. Everybody is on Facebook. They have the lion's share of users, but when you look generationally, they lost tremendous market share with younger generations. It's got to be Snapchat, TikTok, text, symbols, kind of like hieroglyphics again, quicker way to communicate. Millennials, you're also digital, but not quite as visually digital as your younger cohort. Gen X, boy, we really need. First of all, they get really lambasted unfairly. The latchkey, the slackers, not so. They're the ones who experienced a lot of divorce, and therefore they don't have that same sort of, I have to pour myself into the workplace because they watch their parents get downsized, outsourced, offshored. And it's not that they're slackers, it's that nobody was home after school, but that did affect their sense of commitment to the workplace. They're not particularly fond sometimes of millennials because they feel that millennials were a little pampered and they had to be very independent. They'll use email, they'll use cell phones, they'll use text, but they also know many of the new technologies as well. They're the bridge generation that we forget can really be a wonderful bridge, and we need to use them a little bit more. Boomers, hey guys, we actually started social and technological innovation, not millennials. Just give us a little shout out. Unfortunately, we kind of messed things up, but some of us are going back because we're thinking of legacy to work that we thought was complete, but clearly is not. So I want to stop here and just summarize a couple of key points very quickly. Yes, there are so many tools that we have available today for communications. If we only work on the tools, but neglect the culture, then we're going to be in trouble because a tool is exactly that. It's just a tool, nothing more. What we need to do, and I will conclude now with some recommendations. And this will take just one moment. Okay, so what I would say is we have social inaptitude. We're quick on the thumbs and slow in the relationship. It's not only because of technology, it's because we've deprioritized relationships. Good news, if we made relationships less important, we have the power to make them more important. Recommendations, and I can leave this PowerPoint in a PDF form too if you want to send it out. Look, if you don't create incentives, financial recognition, promotional or otherwise, for people to learn new technologies, they're not likely to do so. Additionally, you need to dedicate resources, whether it's HR, PR, and that means to have a dedicated staff person who learns what it means to communicate intergenerationally, not just someone who's suddenly given the new title of intergenerational communication specialist. Flexibility built into project management, more than one way of communicating with each other. By the way, I didn't go into generational stereotypes, never acceptable. They need to be called out honestly because they harm communications. And that's not a question of a tool, that's a question of an attitude. Are you multi-generational or intergenerational? By the way, Occam's razor. So you have to talk about these things openly instead of talking behind one another's backs, right? I mean, have a conversation, the frustrations, what you learn, what you like, what you don't like. And when you're moving to new technologies, new platforms, new tools, you have to explain how this will add value to the customer, to the company, to the employees. You can't just say, we're doing it, but give people an explanation why. Training is good, support is better, right? Don't just train people and say, okay, you've been trained. We all know that feeling, right? Doesn't work very well. So to summarize, have to look at the tools. Please take time to learn the culture, because you cannot separate out the tools from the relationships. And with that, I will stop and say thank you very much.
Thank you, Chaim. We have a couple of minutes for any questions. So anyone who has any questions for Chaim, feel free to raise your hand or add some or type it into the chat. Right. He says, I remember the phrase, the generation gap. I think we've seen that a lot.
Yeah, I would say this is more like a generation gulf. You know, I mean, it's really big because of the issue of discontinuity. I know that boomers got frustrated at millennials. By the way, it's not like I didn't order my millennial from Amazon or buy mine from Target. I mean, you know, if we have a problem with them, we need to look at ourselves. But yeah, like our life is linear.
No, Teddy, just sit. Teddy, can you sit? Thank you.
You may want to mute yourselves. Thank you. But that's okay. Hey, this is like pandemic culture, so anything goes almost. But with millennials, right? Well, of course, they're not going to follow lock, stop, linear, right? Their metaphor is not the ladder. Their metaphor is networks, it's pathways. So we told them they could do anything they want. So like we made our mistakes, we need to let them make theirs. Not an average generation gap. There are too many discontinuities. We need a different word.
Barb, great comment that there is the importance of culture over tools. And yeah, knowing your audience is essential. I think we've all been there as we start talking intergenerational communication, talking about how we communicate across different audiences. And I think it's very important to remember that we need to understand all of our audiences before we start communicating.
Yeah.
And Rose was asking, how do we encourage these conversations among generations in a virtual work setting?
So that kind of brings us right back to the pandemic again. Look, I don't think anybody has found the answer right now, but you know, it's like a struggle between, all right, do we require people to come into an office or meet together for at least several days a week, or, you know, whatever the number of days may be, so that we can get them working together virtually better. That's a very difficult discussion to have. Personally,
Recording in progress.
now we are in the matrix. Personally, I think it's really hard to build a workplace culture virtually, only virtually, right? I think if there isn't some face-to-face meeting, because culture isn't just about, you know, how we speak with one another. There's body language, right? There are different ways of communicating that you can only kind of pick up on in person. And there's something about a level of trust that is, it's not impossible, but when you're dealing with many people in a workplace, my own sense is, if it's only virtual, then you have to lower your expectations on communications. If you are able to get people together, at least some of the time on a consistent basis, face to face, and I acknowledge it's a problem. I mean, I am like severely immunocompromised, right? So that's not so easy to do, right? We have better tools, but we know that the pandemic is not over, despite what we may wish. But still, we have to try to create a safe medical environment, health environment for people to be together in real time, so that they can develop the communications virtually. And that is an opinion, and I know people have different opinions about that.
Can you clarify the metaphor you used? That millennials metaphor is not a ladder. I think you said it's not a ladder, it's a pathway.
Yes. So, as a boomer, right? We had our bucket list, and boy, when I interviewed millennials, I interviewed boomers. Millennials hated the bucket list metaphor. It's like, can't you kick that bucket metaphor out of the way? Why didn't you have fun during your lifetime? Why did you think you had to commit to one job, thinking that you could defer life until retirement, right? But we knew it was either graduation from high school, military service, or first job, college, marriage, first home, up the corporate ladder, golden watch, set of luggage. You had a nice career. But for millennials, they watched what happened to their parents and how they deferred fun, how they weren't around for them at certain times. It was work, work, work. And I think that they drew a valid lesson, namely, and because the digital world opened up, right? And the internet opened up, what happened on the screen, right? Hyperlinking, moving from space to space, exploring. Well, that became a value that they internalized in analog life, or, I hate to call it real life, because digital life is real. It's just different than brick and mortar life. So I can do this for a few years. I can move on for a few more years. And by the way, the economy was not so good to them. So, the idea of being tied to a place that may collapse was also scary. So, they're finding their way, and they're good kids by and large. They don't deserve the stereotypes that they have.
At the time, I think we'll pause questions for Chaim, and we'll start moving into the panel discussion of our program. And Chaim, feel free to weigh in during the panel discussion if you have any comments or insights or anecdotes or numbers you want to add to this conversation as well. I'd also like to remind everyone that as we move into this panel portion, you are encouraged to engage with the panel by posting questions and comments in the chat. So just as we've been doing, I will be monitoring the chat and can bring them to the attention of the panelists. We will also have time for a group discussion following the panel if you have any comments that you'd like to say verbally. Now let me go ahead and introduce our wonderful panelists. So Margaret Ann Hennon is a communications and public relations professional with more than 30 years of experience in Minnesota's business communities. She is an active member of PRSA, a former Minnesota PRSA chapter president, and has served on the National PRSA Board of Directors, the College of Fellows Executive Committee, and the Board of Ethics and Professional Standards. She is the 2021 recipient of the Patrick Jackson Award for Distinguished Service to PRSA and the 2022 chair of the PRSA College of Fellows. I know many of you are also familiar with her on a personal level. We also have Jocelyn Parker. Jocelyn is the Senior Director of Communications and Public Relations at the Minnesota Council of Health Plans, where she is charged with bolstering the reputation of Minnesota's nonprofit health plans through relationship building. Her diverse experience includes management roles at key healthcare organizations, including United Healthcare, where she was the Director of Communications for its Medicaid line of businesses. Prior to working in healthcare, Jocelyn spent more than 15 years as an assigning editor and business reporter for the Minneapolis Star-Tribune, Detroit Free Press, and Dow Jones Newswires. In her spare time, she enjoys mentoring young professionals and has volunteered her time with Minneapolis Public Schools, the University of St. Thomas, Metropolitan State University, and the Brooklyn Park chapter of Toastmasters International. Finally, we have Shai Yang. Shai is a PR coordinator for the content promotion team at BrandPoint. She originally joined BrandPoint as a PR intern in the fall of 2021 and was recently hired full-time after completing her 6-month internship. Shai is currently a senior at Metro State University, majoring in public relations with a minor in project management. As a diversity, equity, and inclusion advocate, Shai serves on BrandPoint's D&I committee and assists with pro bono PR consulting for the Page Education Foundation, helping students of color in Minnesota attend post-secondary institutions through scholarships. And as I've said, I am Cassie Roman, a senior account executive at Pineapple RM and a long-term member of PRSA. I will be moderating our panel and offering some millennial insights as needed. So thank you all for participating. Let's go ahead and get started. So my first question for the panel, can you tell me about a time you noticed a generational divide in your life or at work? What was it and how was it resolved if it was a conflict?
Well, I'll start. My first career was in teaching, and in that career I was a grammar teacher. So, I mean, in part. And a few years ago, we started seeing, I would say, a misuse of pronouns. And I can remember at one time reading something, and all of a sudden it was they. And I thought it was about one person, and then it was they. And I stopped and I started over reading this whole paragraph, only to find out that was indeed one person, and we were using they. So that was kind of a shock to the grammar teacher left in me. And I explored that. Why is that happening? What's going on? And I heard a wonderful panel recently that PRSA put on with their diverse conversations, which is part of the DEI committee. That was the first time I understood why this whole piece around the pronouns was so important to people. So I think the overcoming something is listening. And in fact, I've always thought that was the most important part of communications, but it's listening to what the feelings are underneath there, not just what the end product is. And I guess talking with people and asking why, just like a 2-year-old, why? But boy, that's how you learn, if you listen to the answers.
Jocelyn or Shai, anything you want to add?
I'd like to throw in something there. I think one thing that I have noticed, and this really kind of dates back to my newspaper days. This was before kind of like emojis became super popular. But when I think about like emails and how we're communicating over that, and I think in a newsroom, you have a lot of generations. And one thing that really stuck out to me is just even use of emails versus text messages versus instant messages. And in the journalism world, you have to communicate very fast. And so one thing that I noticed was we had a set of folks in the newsroom who were very dedicated to email. We had some dedicated to instant message. We had some dedicated to text. And the problem with email is that people would not see your message right away. So we really had to do a lot of educating to shift people to do more of the instant messaging and text, to get in touch with someone quickly versus an email where you needed to be maybe a little bit more formal. So that's kind of what I've seen over the years, and I even see it now. And I've had to, again, educate colleagues and younger generations on that. Like, okay, so if you really want to be more formal and you want to kind of map out a plan, maybe an email would be best. And if you want to say something quick and you just want to get your point across, shoot me a text, because I'm gonna always have my phone with me. I'm not gonna always be combing through emails. So that's just one thing that I've noticed. And then I'll get into the emoji piece later. And the LOLs and be right back and all of that. But that's one thing that I have noticed over the years.
So I just have to chime in and say, phones are not for leaving voicemails either.
Huh.
Right? Because nobody listens to them. So thanks for that workplace snapshot, Jocelyn.
Thank you. And honestly, I don't know the last time I checked my voicemail. That's very scary.
Jocelyn, I was about to weigh in on that. One of the generational differences I've seen in my work is simply how we follow up with reporters once we've pitched a story. I mean, do you follow up by email? Or, a lot of times it is most effective to pick up the phone and call, but then there's always the question of, well, do you leave a voicemail, or is calling someone intrusive? I've seen that be a very different generational insight. The older generations that didn't have access to instant messenger or email or text message, I know phone calls are really great. And we've seen some younger generations really not want to pick up the phone or use it at all, because it feels almost intrusive if you never talk on the phone. And then as a millennial, I'm somewhere in between of, I'll hop on the phone if it makes sense. I don't always love it, but I'll do it.
Yeah, I love that point you just made, because like for me, and I know how I'm like, you went through the different generations. So I'm kind of like what you call like a zennial. So I sit in the intersection of Gen X and millennial. So it's like, I think 1977 through 83. So I've kind of experienced kind of both sides of those generations. So for me, I prefer text, because I don't want to intrude on someone's time. But that being said, a lot of times, even in a text, I'll say, hey, this is going to be a lot for me to cover off on in a text. Do you have like 10 minutes where I can just call you really quickly, and so we can just connect on this? And so that has always been a very great go-to approach for me when I want to have the conversation, but I don't want to be like, just pick up the phone and say, hey, now a good time. So thank you for making that point.
Shai, is there anything you want to add?
Not for this one, no. Thank you.
All right. Well, we got a great question posted in the chat as well. How about we talk about, is there any insights on the intersection of race and generations? And I will say, I know, as we move towards the younger generations, I believe it's Gen Z is the most diverse generation. So I think that that is starting to become an important conversation.
Mhm. Yeah, so one thing I've noticed even with my own kids, I have two kids and they're adult kids, so they are Gen Zers, so they are 18 and 20. And so one of the things that they always bring to my attention when you think about race relations, and I guess it shows in some ways how far we have come as a country, is, you know, they'll say things like, well, why by that question? It's like, well, what do you mean by that? And they're like, well, you know, can't we all just get along? Can't we just, you know, all coexist? And so sometimes I have to kind of take a step back and say, okay, when you think about the civil rights movement, like that wasn't that long ago. Like you think about 50 years ago. I always tell them, think about your grandmother. You know, she lived through Jim Crow and things like that. And so it's interesting when I think about like my parents who went through a lot of those things, race is always at the forefront for them versus my children. You know, it's there. They recognize they're African American, but they also, because they don't have that lived experience and they haven't gone through some of those things, they don't see it the same way. And so that's where I feel like, because I'm at this interesting intersection between generations, I can say, okay, I see your point, but that being said, there are a lot of people who died so that you can have these rights. This is why you need to go out and vote. This is why you need to do these things. So that is one observation that I had.
And just to jump in quickly, I mean, I think that's a fascinating point. I hear that with, you know, my own Jewish community as well, even though anti-Semitism is at an all-time high in the United States. But that's where intergenerational perspectives, culture comes in, like why one generation may not fear saying certain things and another generation may respond with, you can't say that, or vice versa. Right. So if it's only about the tools and, you know, texting versus like, you know, a quick phone call, that doesn't get deep enough to understand the lived experiences that really influence what people are willing to communicate and how they're willing to communicate it. So thank you for bringing up that point.
Yeah, I would just like to add to the conversation that I also hear a lot of, and I'd like to add, I'm also a millennial, Cassie, so just want to put that out there. There is a lot of talk between cultural appropriation and cultural appreciation, and just understanding that, you know, which side are we really on, and also understanding those distinctions so that we don't make that mistake. And so, Rabbi Herring, I really appreciate during your conversation calling things out, because that's the only way we'll know. And so I really appreciated you bringing that up and just talking things out and asking why and listening. So I really appreciate that. And I just want to note, I am a first-gen Hmong American, and so my parents are immigrants. And I remember growing up and like translating for my mom between English and Hmong and trying to basically just being intersected between that. And so it definitely is such, I'm just happy to see that we're talking about it, and it's more than just what we see. And so that culture aspect is very important.
I think ultimately, if there's ever a doubt, ask. I had that issue actually over the weekend. I went to an Indian wedding because a really close friend of mine is Indian and was getting married. And on the invite, it asked for Indian attire for one of the events. And the first question I had to ask was, okay, as a white girl, is it appropriate for me to be wearing Indian attire to your wedding? And if so, how do I go about getting Indian attire? Where can I go? What do I do? So even for simple things like that, it's just, don't be afraid, ask the question, and make sure you're coming from a very genuine place and that you're willing to listen and to accept whatever answer that you are given. Great. Interesting question we just saw. So Jocelyn stated that she's at the intersection of Gen X and Millennial. This is a message from Amy. She says she's at the intersection of Boomer and Gen X. There haven't been many articles about what intersection people mean. So do you have anything to add or any insights about people that are at the intersection of generations?
Jocelyn, do you want to take that? Because I think
Yeah,
it's a great question, but I'd like you to hear from
yeah.
you.
So I just want to be clear. So you're saying, do you like how to navigate between the two generations? Is that kind of more the question that we're getting at, or?
Yep, sounds like yes. How do you navigate being between the two generations?
Yeah, so I think about like things like social media, for instance. So I have boomer parents, and my dad is not on any social media. My mom is, and so she's always coming to me about, okay, how do I do this on Facebook? How do I share this? How do I post this? And I think for me, it's being sensitive to those needs and also recognizing my own blind spot. So again, using a social media example, my son recently admonished me he's like, on Instagram, you post too much. That should be a story. That should not be a post. This is not post worthy. And so I appreciate that advice too. So that's just one example of kind of living between generations and living, trying to navigate all of these new technologies and their uses and how to be relevant and how to be appropriate. And I'll tell you another funny story with my kids. My son had shared like a photo collage of how he's changed since he was like 15. He's a track and field person. So how he's changed since he was 15 to now he's at North Dakota State, and just a collage of athletic photos. And so it's funny, I in his stories, I reacted to those photos with an emoji with the heart eyes, and he immediately got back to me and says, "Mom, no, not the heart eyes. No, you can't send that. Just send a thumbs up or a like." Okay, my bad. So again, and the same thing with my mom. Sometimes she'll post stuff and I'm like, you might want to take that down, or you might want to do something a little different with that. So it's being sensitive to both. It's recognizing that you don't know everything and you don't have all the answers. So for me, that's been what it is.
Well, the other thing I'll quickly add is, there are good reasons to try to create labels that help us understand differences. There's I think a dark side to that too, because a label can still become a stereotype. And for people who, quote, navigate generations, right, where do you fit? And not only that, when we label people, we forget about what I would call, and not millennial, schlemenial, but perennial, right? Don't we all, just like perennial flowers that draw upon the root system, right, to nourish the next year's plants after the prior ones kind of die off? Can't we think perennially? Meaning we all have a shared task as human beings, and that is to let go of that which really restrains us, has harmed us, to hold on to that which is still valuable, but at the same time to be open to planting those seeds because we want variety. I mean, we all know how good that is for us. So we have to think both, and we have to think intergenerationally, right, about who we are and how we communicate. But I think part of the communications challenge is to bring us above the labels and to also have us think perennially.
I'd like to move us into kind of a fun next question. So I know we've had some different pieces about how formal you should be in communication, and each of the different generations has different level of formality. So I'd like to touch on what your opinion is in formality in the workplace, even down to, what kind of clothing can you wear? Is it appropriate ever to wear a tank top to work? Or how about email sign-offs? What is an appropriate email sign-off? And can you use emojis in emails with clients, bosses, or anyone else?
I think for me, it depends on who I'm like, in going back to email and emojis, it depends on who I'm working with. And it doesn't stop at emojis. I mean, one thing that I've noticed is even things like exclamation points. Like people are like, okay, why do people write with those so much? And I've said, I think it's a generational thing. When you write with an exclamation point, people feel like you're excited about what you have to say versus some, other generations say, well, you're not really saying anything that exciting, right? So I think it depends on who you're communicating with. So I think about now in my current situation, I have a leader who's younger than I am. And so I feel very comfortable using emojis. And sometimes that kind of takes, I hate to say it like this, but sometimes they help take some of the edge off, right? Like if you're trying to communicate something that's a little difficult and you're trying to be upbeat, especially in this virtual world where you don't always have time to get on the phone and have the long conversation, which sometimes I prefer depending on what the message is. But then, I've worked in other places, like I think about my time at United Health Group, and, when we were crafting messages, we had attorneys involved, we had all compliance people involved, and you never wanted to send an emoji to those folks because they're like, this is serious business. And you know what? Your smiley face is not going to prevent us from getting sued. So it really depends on who you're communicating with for me.
I agree. And that whole idea of it depends, that's my answer for so many things. It's not really that I'm that wishy-washy, but it really does depend who I'm talking to, what my message is, and how that's going to be received. And isn't that the principle of communication that we've been working with for years, and not really thinking so much about, well, I'm talking to a millennial, or I'm talking to another boomer, or I'm whatever. We're really looking at how is this person going to react to this, and how do I not offend that person? Unless offending a person is your goal, which, generally is not the case.
Yeah, I would also like to add that I was surprised when my manager first sent me an emoji, like, oh, this is okay, we can do this. So I think, again, it's always about understanding who is the receiver of the message, and then as well as the content. And so if we're just talking about our weekend, like, had a great weekend, went out for a walk, emoji. But if it's a more work-related / business-related email, then yes, we tend to be more formal. That's just what I've noticed.
With what everyone said, it depends on the content and context. If you're really doing something serious, no. I'd also say if it's a new client, probably not. But if it's a client you've known for years and you have a really solid relationship with, then yes.
Keyword, relationship.
Yes. Though it also makes me wonder, and let's see if we can talk on this one. What are your views on having clients as friends on social media?
I think again, it depends on the relationship. So some clients, colleagues, I know really well. I consider some of them friends. And so I feel like, okay, if I'm your friend, it's probably okay for you to connect with me on social media. However, if I don't know them well, probably not, because I think that might be a little awkward.
and can be taken out of context so easily.
Mhm.
But Jocelyn, what happens if you've gotten a friend request from a client? I mean, I saw somebody put up a comment like only
Yeah.
connect on LinkedIn, which is where I'm at. But what do you do
Yeah.
when you're in that awkward situation when somebody wants to be your friend?
Yeah. So here's so first of all, here's my approach to social media in general. I tend to not post anything too polarizing, political. It's pretty plain vanilla, because I have friends I'm connected to from all walks of life, all political parties, so I try to walk that line. So for me personally, if someone reaches out to me on social media, to connect with me, most of the time I do accept the connection because it's not as though I'm doing anything really provocative on social media. However, I know I have peers and colleagues and friends who say, you know what, I don't connect with people I work with. I don't connect with clients. I keep my social media solely for those close relationships. And I respect that because, they may share a little bit more. They may have, a more polarizing view, or maybe not. They just want to keep their personal and private life to themselves. So for me personally, as again, if my social media is not all that exciting, so you're not going to find out that much that I don't already share already. Because when I talk to whether it's a vendor I'm working with or whether I'm talking to a journalist, I try to be human, and I try to say, hey, how's your family doing, and things like that. So you'll know that about me anyway when you engage with me. So if you connect with me on social media, it's going to just validate what I've already said. But again, I can understand why people would want to keep that private.
And it kind of depends on how you use social media, I think. I rarely post anything on Facebook. In fact, if I do, I kind of get comments from my friends saying, whoa, something's up, or you wouldn't be doing this. I tend more to respond to other people's posts. And I never really thought my life was all that interesting that people wanted to know what I was doing from minute to minute anyway. So I never did get in that habit of using Facebook in that way. But, again, it's a written document. And I go back to that so often, but that's, that whole, and it's probably having started as a teacher, and how vulnerable do you make yourself to the public, and what's going to come back to haunt you, because you don't want to offend people unnecessarily, although I seem to be able to do that without being intentional about it. So if I'm thinking about it, I surely don't want to do it. So I think that it's a part of that whole, how much of yourself do you want to reveal? How much do you want people to know? And frankly, who cares if I went out to the symphony last night, or, it's just, doesn't seem that important to other people, to me.
One thing I want to add to that, and I think this is also kind of a generational thing, and I've again noticed this probably more so with my kids, is social media it's your brand. It's become part of your brand, right? Mm-hmm. So it's not just you connecting and talking to people and responding. It's sort of building this persona, building who you are. And so again, I've had to become better about posting and trying to kind of build up, well, who am I? What do I stand for? And that's always a super hard balance. Because to your point, Margaret, like, I don't want to create this, paper trail, if you will, of, saying the wrong thing. And then people see that and they're like, oh, so your view is this way, especially like if you're in public relations and you're representing health plans and you're in healthcare, you do have to be careful about what you say. So it's always that balance of how much do I want to build my personal brand versus, I don't want to go too far. So thank you for that.
I think that line between, private and public, between, personal and, hey world, here I am. I'm not sure that line exists anymore for younger generations. I will tell you that I'd love to disconnect totally from Facebook. I tried it, but I want to see what's going on with my family and my friends. But I rarely post on Facebook. I use LinkedIn a lot more. And in terms of putting your views out there, I'm in a different position because I'm not an influencer, but as a person in the clergy involved in community, it's like I have to put my views out there. I have to know what I stand for. And of course, it can be extremely unpleasant until you get to a certain age. And, I hope not to offend people intentionally, but my view is my view. This is my stance. So it's different for me, but I really don't like Facebook because of how much damage it's done to young women, to teens. And I've got an increasing problem with it, but I can't totally disconnect. So I don't have an answer, but it's difficult.
I'll jump over to one of the next questions. As we were preparing for this, the panel was talking about how every generation has something very unique to offer, whether it's the wisdom from the boomer generation or Gen Z's touching base on all of the new technology and ability to understand new things like TikTok. So how do we help encourage more reciprocal mentorship and interactions between generations in the workplace?
I'll jump in and just say one thing that I've always tried to make a habit of doing is having a personal board of directors, right? So close friends, colleagues, confidants, people that I can go to if I'm trying to make a difficult career decision, or I'm trying to spearhead a certain project, I'm trying to get expertise. And when I think about my personal board of directors, they are people that I've mentored. They are people who've mentored me. They are peers. They really are from all different walks of life and generations. And honestly, that is how I've learned to navigate some generations is through these relationships. And one thing I will say about mentorship is, especially when I think about journalism and communications and how much the field has changed over the years, when I'm mentoring students, I'm like, oh, so they're not teaching that anymore, or they are doing this a different way, and just ways of how you consume your news. I'm always pleasantly surprised at how many students still want to go into journalism and want to work at a newspaper, because for a while there it was like, our newspaper is going to exist in 20 years, and they will, maybe in a different format, but they will. So again, when you're working with young people, and again, when you're working with folks who have a few years on you, you learn to appreciate those lived experiences, and you learn a lot yourself from those.
That was wonderfully said, Jocelyn. I just want to also tag on top of that. I see a mentor as someone who believes in you, especially when maybe you don't, or can, guide you into the right direction. And though I'm still early on in my career, even in school, I've had mentors, and whether it be personal, professional, or for educational purposes, I definitely see that whether it's for a reason, a season, or a lifetime, they're the ones that are there to pick you up on those days when you're down. And I think one thing that I've really appreciated is that maybe as a mentee, showing them that they can also lean on you. So whether you nominate them for a specific award or just sending that thank you note and showing your appreciation. So that's something that I've really come to value, is that, you know, it's not so much just, you know, what can I take from you, but also what I can offer you and give back as well. So I really appreciate everything that you said, and just kind of wanted to add in my personal insight as well.
Thank you. I appreciate what you just said. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'd say for me, there's nothing more exciting than learning, right? That curiosity piece that people mentioned. And, you know, I can learn as much from, you know, a teenager as someone, you know, I also connect with a 104-year-old man every week, and we study the weekly Torah reading, you know. So if you're open, I think it really has to do about openness. You can learn something from everyone, but you have to structure in the workplace, right? Intentionally structure. Let's say there's a new technology that's brought on board, right? Then this is a chance for that reciprocal mentoring where somebody younger can help somebody who's older. But when it comes to, you know, some perspective, some experience base, that, you know, technology is not the answer to everything. You still have to bring your experience to bear upon it. Then that's where that reciprocity piece comes in. If you don't structure it, it's not likely to happen though.
I'd also like to get all of your inputs on, what do you think a strength and a weakness of most of the different generations are? I actually, this kind of was inspired even by seeing a message from Kent talking about how the older generations seem to understand different rules of communication or different pieces that we've, you know, never really thought of, down to not all young people know how to actually address an envelope because we don't send mail anymore. So yeah, I'd love to get your perspective on, you know, strengths and weaknesses, and what you think we can best learn from each other.
Well, I've always been fascinated with history. So that learning from the generations that preceded me was always part of my life, probably because I had lots of aunts and uncles and my grandparents, and we would have conversations. And, you know, yeah, sometimes it'd be the same story a couple times, but I was fascinated by learning what life had been like. And I think the same is true if you go down and have conversations with the younger generation. I can remember my cousin's granddaughter saying to me one day, "Oh, I have wanted to do this my whole life." She's 4 years old at the time. But, you know, for her, that was huge. Not necessarily what she wanted to do, but the fact that she was seeing this world from a totally new set of eyes. And we tend to discount children who say, I have this terrible problem or this big trauma, and we don't listen to them. And again, listening and probing and hearing what they have to say, they may feel better at the end, which is always a good thing. But you can gain so much from just listening to other people's experiences. And right now, I think with pandemic, we are all under trauma of different sorts and feeling it in different ways. But the reality is that affects our communication. And how we listen, how we affirm, doesn't matter what I feel. If that's how you feel, then if I'm having a conversation with you, I really need to affirm how you feel. And so often we discount how other people feel because, oh, it wasn't that bad. Just, you know, pull up your pants and move along. And life's not that simple. Or we would not have the suicide rates that we have across generations. So it's, again, goes back to the principles of communications. Listen, empathize, thank them for being open with you, and invite them to continue to be open. Pretty basic. communication theory.
You know, one thing that I have noticed with my children, and to some extent when I've worked in newsrooms, and you know, was an editor for a long time, it's just how you research, how you find information. And I think while the internet is a great expansive tool to have, I always say, you know what? Sometimes you need to go to the library. Sometimes you need to actually pick up a real book and read it and internalize it. And I had this conversation with my younger son who started college this year, and he was doing a paper, and he's like, well, how do I do a footnote? How do I? And I was very surprised, like, well, you don't know how to do that? Like, you didn't, you know, so I'm assuming that this just all is taught now, and maybe it was, and maybe he just didn't retain it from high school. But you know, I said to him, you can't just pull articles from the web. You have to do that research. You have to broaden your mind beyond what you see on social media and the internet. So I think that's been a weakness, candidly. But at the same time, I'm gonna go back to my mom. I hate to keep picking on her. And, you know, she's trying to plan for something. And I'm like, well, have you tried Googling it? Have you, you know, like some things you don't need to come to me for. It's out there. Read the reviews. Like, you've got all of this information at your disposal. So I think when you think about all of the generations and how they're working together, I think we have to use the best of those, you know, it's the best of both worlds, right? Like you want to use the internet and social media to inform yourself, but it can't stop there. You have to actually pick up a book, and you have to know, to your point, Margaret, you have to know your history. Because if you don't know your history, you just don't know, hate to use a cliche, you don't know where you're going, you don't know where you're headed. And so I think that's an area where I think all of the generations kind of need to improve upon.
Yeah, one more thing I wanted to add, and I think, Margaret, and you said that earlier, is it also comes down to relationships. And one strength that I've seen in my work life so far is learning how to build and cultivate relationships from my leaders. And so I think that being a millennial, it's kind of weird because we remember life before the digital age, but then we've also evolved with it as well. So we're so used to, oh, I'll just send this person a direct message or an instant message, but it's more so than just that. It's also that face-to-face time matters, and just asking those questions and also listening. And so sometimes we lose that, or there's a disconnect in that when we are, you know, using these digital tools and platforms. And so just wanted to note that as well.
And I'll add just a personal anecdote. Years ago, my late father-in-law, you know, as I think they were moving, you know, down to Florida because Midwest is too cold. He said, you know, I've got these stacks of Time magazine newspapers, and they're going to be very important one day. And I said, you know, Dad, you know, why don't you just put them in the garbage? And he said, no, you don't understand. You know, you should have these, you know, you may find them interesting, you know, your children may find, and like after the third time, I got it. This was something that he valued.
Mm-hmm.
And I wasn't listening to him. It was about the relationship that he had with me. And I think we're, you know, we've all been so busy pre-pandemic, you know, pulled in many different directions. Now we've got, you know, a couple years of COVID, and however long it will continue to be here, it's like we've been isolated. We forget how to communicate. But I think to Margaret's point, you can't communicate if you don't begin with listening.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where sometimes people, you know, who may ask for help, let's say they don't only need the help, they need that reassurance, they need the personal reinsurance, or sometimes that may be the guys for saying, hey, I miss you, you know, I'd like to be with you. And that happens at work too. And I am so concerned about the mental health toll. I have no idea how you calculate it. I mean, I you know, as Margaret mentioned before, the suicide rates across the board going up, but boy, I mean, we're going to need people, I would say, in this room who have very good listening skills to be attentive to what's going on with people's mental health. Have to be careful, can't ask them, but that may be showing up in the workplace, because that's going to be here for a long, long time. And it's very painful.
And we don't know the effects of trauma on any one of us, myself included. And they don't come necessarily to talk about it to you, anyone, to get a solution. And we're always, public relations people are so good at solutions and tactics, and we want to jump right into that. That's not what they necessarily need. What they need is ears. So it's kind of 2 ears, 1 mouth, use them proportionately. We need to let people vent, for lack of a better word, just to have somebody validate their story.
I would say, I think the younger generations, a great strength of theirs, I think that there is more of an emphasis on protecting your mental health and trying to prevent burnout and really protecting your space and trying to focus on a work-life balance. Now I'm looking at the time. I'm gonna ask us one last question just to get us wrapped up. And anyone who is participating, feel free to unmute and weigh in as well. But I'd just like to overall wrap up with the question of, how do you think that we can all work together to foster a situation and an environment where people aren't afraid to speak up with ideas, to bring their strengths to the table, to not have to be worried about, you know, feeling stupid for trying to weigh in on something, and just also making sure that, you know, we stay open and don't get stuck in the mud and don't get stuck in our ways.
I'm going to jump in really quickly. Volunteer outside of work, practice, acquire a friend. I mean, there's a Hebrew term for that. Become friends with at least one person who's a generation older and one person who's a generation younger, and begin to bring those perspectives into the workplace.
I would say, you know, for me, it's usually a simple question that kind of kick things off. You know, if it's someone I already know, I just will pop in, you know, whether it's in person or if it's a text or a phone call, and just say, you know, how are things going? You know, sometimes a simple question like that will kick off some interesting conversation. Especially if you have a relationship with them, or sometimes even if you don't, you know, because they'll say, well, you know, thanks for asking, you know, things are going fine. And then you're just like, okay, well, you know, let me know if you need anything. I'm here to listen. And so I think sometimes just making that simple outreach makes all the difference when it comes to relationships and connecting with people.
And I think we have to kind of call out people, ourselves included, if we're not listening or if we react badly to a suggestion from someone else. You know, even just a simple, hey, wait a minute, let's hear the rest of this. Let's get that full committee report. Let's not cut people off in the middle of a conversation, that kind of a message, because we're all responsible if we don't remind our colleagues about basic respect.
Yeah, one thing I'd like to add as well is I'm appreciative that my leaders ask me directly, or they create an open and safe environment for us to speak up, especially you know, sharing fresh or new ideas during our brainstorm sessions and whatnot. and, you know, from all levels, junior, executive, and whatnot. So I think that's one thing that I'm grateful to see in my place of work, is that, you know, the doors are open.
Good point.
Mhm.
It is 9:30, so we are at time. So I don't want to take up anyone's time. I know we all have meetings to get to, but thank you for everyone who attended. And a big thank you to our panelists and to Chaim for sharing your insights. And I know that this was recorded and will be put online. So we will be sharing and encourage you guys to share as well.